My name is Isabella, and up until a few weeks ago, I thought I had everything anyone could ever dream of. I was the daughter of a wealthy businessman, Richard, and a renowned fashion designer, Olivia. My life, or at least the one I thought I had, seemed flawless. Every Sunday evening, we would gather as a family for dinner in our grand home, the warm glow of chandeliers illuminating the elegantly set table. My father would sit at the head, speaking with pride about his latest business deals, while my mother, always dressed in something new and exquisite, would smile beside him. To the outside world, we were the epitome of success. A powerful man with a beautiful, talented wife and a daughter who had every opportunity handed to her. I believed our life was perfect. But, as it often happens, perfection is an illusion. It all started one rainy Thursday evening, the kind of night that makes everything feel heavier than usual. I had been out with friends, a light dinner followed by drinks. I wasn't drunk, but I was tipsy enough to let my guard down when I returned home late. The house was unusually quiet as I stepped through the front door, the silence pressing against me. I tossed my keys onto the side table by the door and kicked off my heels, feeling the coolness of the marble floor beneath my bare feet. The first thing I noticed was the faint sound of voices from the living room. It was odd, considering the time. I paused, curious, before walking towards the sound. As I approached, I could make out my father's voice, low, urgent, but unmistakably familiar. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. I froze in the hallway, a chill running through me. It was rare for my father to sound so vulnerable. I didn't want to intrude, but something about the moment tugged at me. I crept closer, my breath caught in my chest, and peered around the corner. What I saw shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. My father was sitting on the couch, his hands clasped together in his lap. But it wasn't just my father I saw. There, standing in front of him, was another woman. I didn't recognize her immediately, but the way she stood so confidently in the room made me feel like a stranger in my own home. "Richard," the woman said, her voice smooth, almost too calm, "you know what we talked about. I can't keep doing this, but we need to figure this out, for the sake of everything we've built." I felt the floor shift beneath me. A wave of nausea hit me, and I took a step back, trying to steady myself. My father, who I had always admired, who I thought was the backbone of our perfect family, was having an affair. I couldn't breathe. My mind was spinning as I tried to make sense of the scene before me. The woman's words echoed in my head. "We need to figure this out." What did that mean? Were they planning something? Was this just a passing moment, or something much deeper? I wanted to run, to leave the house and escape the reality that had just been forced upon me, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, caught in the web of betrayal, and yet I hadn't even confronted my father yet. I had to know the truth. But what was the truth? As the woman continued speaking, I turned away quietly, slipping into the nearby hallway. I didn't want to hear more, didn't want to see them any longer. I had to get out of that moment before my heart shattered completely. I climbed the stairs slowly, my mind a whirl of confusion and disbelief. In my bedroom, I collapsed onto my bed, pulling my knees up to my chest. The warm glow of the streetlights outside filtered in through my window, but all I could feel was the cold emptiness that had settled in my chest. My father, the man who I thought had it all together, was no different from the other men who made mistakes, lied, and betrayed the people they loved. My mother, the woman I admired, would never know. I couldn't bear the thought of her heart breaking, of her world unraveling in front of her. What was I supposed to do? How could I tell her? Could I even confront him? And most importantly, could I ever look at my family the same way again? I had no answers, only questions, and a heart filled with a pain I couldn't name. The days that followed were nothing short of a blur. I went through the motions, school, meals, and awkward conversations with both of my parents. I tried to act like everything was fine, but every glance at my father or my mother felt like a betrayal of its own. How could I look at them the same way? How could I look at my father the same way? And how could I ever imagine my mother standing by him, as she always had? The facade of our perfect family had shattered into pieces, and I was left trying to hold them together, even though I didn't know how. But I couldn't keep living in this fog. I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened, couldn't pretend I didn't know. The tension inside me had become unbearable, suffocating. I had to confront my father. And I had to do it soon. It was late Saturday afternoon when I finally decided to speak to him. The house was quiet, as it often was on weekends, with my mother at her studio and my father in his study. I walked past his office door and paused for a moment, gathering my courage. It was strange, knowing that the man inside that room was the same one who had raised me, the one who taught me to be strong, independent, and trusting. And yet, he had destroyed the very trust one had in him. I knocked gently on the door. "Come in," his voice called out from the other side. I opened the door slowly, stepping inside. My father looked up from his desk, surprised to see me standing there. There was a moment of silence, a beat that hung in the air like a heavy cloud. His brow furrowed slightly, and he pushed his chair back, standing up. "What's going on, honey?" he asked, his voice full of concern. He had always been the type to keep his emotions in check, a trait I had admired growing up. But now, it only made me more nervous. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind inside me. He motioned for me to sit, and I hesitated before taking the chair across from him. We sat there for a few moments, neither of us speaking, the silence stretching between us. "I know," I finally said, my words rushing out in a quiet but firm tone. "I know about the woman." His face didn't change, not at first. He just stared at me, as though I hadn't said anything. But I could see the subtle shift in his eyes, the guilt, the discomfort. It was enough. "Izzy," he began, using the nickname he'd always called me, "I didn't want you to find out like this. I didn't want to hurt you." "Hurt me?" I echoed, a bitter laugh escaping my lips before I could stop it. "You think you're the only one hurt here?" His expression softened, and I could tell he was trying to find the right words, trying to explain himself. But the truth was, there was no explanation that would make this okay. I had seen it all with my own eyes, him sitting there, listening to her, looking at her in a way that he had never looked at my mother. The thought made my stomach churn. "I know I've made a mistake," he said, his voice laced with regret. "But it wasn't supposed to happen like this. It's complicated, and..." "Complicated?" I cut him off, my voice rising. "You've been lying to us. To Mom. To me. You don't get to call that complicated." My father closed his eyes for a moment, as though gathering his thoughts, trying to steady himself. When he opened them again, his gaze was softer, but there was something else, something I had never seen before. He looked vulnerable. "I never wanted to hurt your mother," he said quietly, his voice almost pleading. "What happened between us, it's something that just happened over time. It's not what I want, not what I was planning on, but it's happened, and now I don't know how to fix it." I felt a pang in my chest. There was so much sadness in his voice, so much regret, but I wasn't sure it was enough. "Do you even love her anymore?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His face faltered for a moment, as though I had caught him off guard. But then he nodded, slowly, as if admitting something painful. "Yes. I love her, Izzy. But love isn't always enough to hold things together. Sometimes people grow apart. And when they do, things get messy." The words stung. I had never imagined hearing something like that from my father, especially not about my mother. "What about me? Do you love me?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "How can you love me if you're doing this to us?" His gaze softened, and he leaned forward, placing his hands on the edge of the desk. "I love you more than anything in this world, sweetheart. I never wanted you to be caught in the middle of this. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did," I said simply, the tears threatening to spill over now. "You hurt me, and you hurt Mom. And you've hurt everything I believed in. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." For a moment, there was only silence, as my father looked at me, not with the authority I had always seen, but with the same vulnerability I had never known he had. "Isabella," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to betray you or your mother. I'm trying to figure out what I can do, but I understand if you can't forgive me. I know I've lost your trust." The words felt heavy, more so than I had anticipated. And yet, as much as I wanted to hate him, as much as I wanted to scream at him for everything he had done, a small part of me still clung to the hope that he could make it right. But how could I forgive him? How could I move forward when everything I had known was nothing more than a lie? The days after my conversation with my father blurred into one long, unbearable stretch of indecision and anxiety. I had thought that confronting him would bring clarity, but instead, I felt more lost than ever. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to feel. I didn't know how to move forward, and every time I tried to sort through the tangled mess of emotions in my mind, I found myself even more confused than before. My father's words echoed in my mind, "I love you more than anything in this world." He had said he never wanted to hurt me. But how could I believe that? How could I reconcile the man who had given me everything, the life, the luxury, the safety, with the man who had betrayed my mother, the woman who had given up everything for him? And then there was my mother. I hadn't spoken to her about it yet. How could I? I didn't even know where to begin. The idea of telling her, of shattering her world, terrified me. She had always been the strong one, the one who carried herself with elegance and grace no matter what happened in her life. I couldn't bring myself to destroy that. She deserved better than the pain I knew would follow if I told her the truth. But what if she already knew? What if she had seen the signs, just like I had? The thought of her face, the expression of hurt and disbelief, haunted me. I didn't want to be the one to break her, but I also didn't want to let my father's betrayal go unspoken. I found myself confiding in my friends more than ever, seeking their advice and opinions, but they didn't understand. How could they? Their parents weren't living in this perfect bubble of wealth and success, a bubble that, in an instant, had popped and left me standing in the wreckage. Everyone told me the same thing: "You have to talk to your mom, Izzy. She deserves to know." But how could I? How could I rip away the last shred of security she had in this world? I couldn't imagine the devastation it would cause. She adored my father. Despite everything, she was still so in love with him, even after everything that had happened. I wasn't sure if I was ready to destroy that. Still, as the days passed, I began to see that I had no choice. My silence was eating me alive. Every time I saw my mother, every time I watched her work, her elegant fingers stitching together beautiful fabrics, I felt like I was betraying her. I had to tell her the truth. It was the right thing to do, even if it would break her heart. It was a rainy evening when I finally made the decision. I had been sitting in my room, staring out the window as the storm raged outside, when my mother knocked on the door. She came in, her eyes soft, her presence as warm and comforting as always. "Isabella," she said, her voice gentle, "we need to talk." My heart skipped a beat. I knew what was coming. She had to know something. I looked at her, unable to keep the emotions from showing on my face. "What is it, Mom?" She stepped closer, sitting on the edge of my bed, her gaze steady but filled with concern. "You've been distant lately. You're not yourself. Is something wrong?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I couldn't do it. Not yet. She reached out and touched my hand. "You can tell me anything, sweetheart. I know you're struggling, but whatever it is, we'll get through it together." Her kindness made my stomach churn. I didn't want to hurt her. I didn't want to break her heart. "Izzy, please," she urged softly. "Whatever it is, I can help." Her words were so tender, so full of love, and that was what made it harder. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the only way to move forward was to jump into the unknown. I had to tell her the truth, even if it meant destroying the last semblance of the life we once had. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to speak. Mom, I know about Dad. I know about the woman. Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she hadn't heard me correctly. What are you talking about? Her voice trembled as she spoke. I felt the tears begin to well up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I had to be strong. For her. For me. I saw them together, Mom, I whispered, my voice breaking. I saw him with her. He's been cheating on you. I could see the shock in her eyes, the disbelief. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. She just sat there, looking at me as though I had ripped her heart from her chest. I wanted to apologize, to take it all back, but I couldn't. The truth was out now, and it had to be said. After what felt like an eternity, my mother finally spoke. Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure? I nodded. Yes, Mom. I'm sure. She looked down, her eyes blank, as if she were trying to process everything I had just said. The silence in the room was suffocating. I could hear the rain pounding against the window, the sound of my heart breaking with every passing second. Finally, she stood up, her body rigid, her face a mask of disbelief. I need to think, she said quietly. I need to be alone. She turned and walked out of the room without another word, leaving me alone with the weight of the truth. I sat there, feeling emptier than I ever had before. I had done the right thing, hadn't I? I had told her. She deserved to know, even if it hurt her beyond measure. But now, I was left with nothing but silence and uncertainty. I didn't know what would happen next. Would she stay with him? Would she leave him? I didn't know. All I knew was that my world, the world I had once thought was perfect, had fallen apart, and I didn't know how to fix it. The days that followed my conversation with my mother were some of the most suffocating of my life. I had told her everything, and in return, I received nothing but silence. She had barely spoken to me since that night. I could tell that she was lost in her own thoughts, her world unraveling at the seams. The woman who had always been so strong, so graceful, was now a shell of herself. I watched as she retreated into the isolation of her own mind, becoming more distant with each passing day. She no longer smiled as she used to. She no longer worked in the studio with the same passion. Instead, she spent hours locked away in her room, her eyes hollow and distant, as though trying to shut out the world. I didn't know how to reach her. I didn't know how to comfort her. I didn't know what to say. I tried to talk to her, to offer my support, but every attempt seemed to fall flat. She would nod, her responses short and hollow, but nothing seemed to penetrate her sorrow. It was clear to me that the world I had known was gone. My family, the perfect picture of wealth and happiness, was now a broken, shattered thing. My father and mother were both lost in their own personal griefs, and I was stuck somewhere in between, trying to navigate the wreckage of our once perfect life. But my father was still there. Still pretending like everything was normal. His meetings continued, his business deals never seemed to stop. He acted as though he had no remorse, no guilt. He tried to act like nothing had changed, but I could see it. I could feel it. The air between us was thick with tension. Every time he spoke to me, every time I caught a glimpse of him, I wanted to scream, to ask him how he could live with himself. But all I did was stay silent, avoiding him whenever I could. One evening, after another long day of avoiding my father and attempting to comfort my mother, I found myself alone in the kitchen. The house was eerily quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I was sitting at the counter, trying to find some semblance of peace when my father walked in. He looked just like he always did, impeccably dressed, his expression calm, his demeanor as controlled as ever. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at me, as though waiting for me to speak. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, finally breaking the silence. I didn't know how to respond. "Sorry for what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know I've messed up. I've made a mistake. I never meant to hurt you or your mother. I've been a fool. I could feel the anger rising in me, the frustration I had been holding in for so long. A fool? That's all you have to say? I stood up, my hands trembling. Do you think that's enough? Do you think saying sorry makes everything okay? He looked at me, his eyes full of regret. I don't expect you to forgive me, Izzy. I don't expect things to go back to the way they were. I just want you to know that I'm sorry for everything. For all of it. I shook my head, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on me. Sorry isn't enough. You destroyed everything, our family, our trust, our lives. His face tightened, and I could see the pain in his eyes. I know. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm trying. I don't want to lose you, too. Then why did you do it? I asked, my voice breaking. How could you hurt Mom like this? How could you betray her? I wasn't thinking. I didn't mean for it to happen, he said, his voice growing softer. I know that's not an excuse. But it's the truth. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to yell at him, to make him feel the weight of his actions. But instead, I just stood there, too exhausted to fight. I had spent so many nights laying awake, going over every detail of what had happened, trying to make sense of it all, but I couldn't. There was no way to fix this. No way to go back to the way things were. I need time, I said finally, my voice steady but cold. I can't talk to you right now. I can't deal with this anymore. He nodded, his face full of sorrow. I understand. Just know that I'm here, whenever you're ready. I didn't respond. I turned away and walked out of the room, my heart heavy with the weight of the truth I had learned. I felt like a stranger in my own home. It wasn't just my father I didn't recognize anymore, it was the whole life I had built, the entire world I had known. Everything felt different, everything felt wrong, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending that I could hold it all together. As the days passed, my father and I fell into an uneasy silence. He continued his work, pretending as though nothing had happened, while my mother sank deeper into herself. I didn't know what she was going to do. Would she stay with him? Would she leave him? I couldn't bring myself to ask. I was too afraid of the answer. But then, one evening, my mother did something I hadn't expected. She came to me, her eyes red and swollen from crying, her face pale. She stood in the doorway of my room, looking lost. For the first time since everything had come to light, she spoke to me in a way that made me feel like she truly needed me. Izzy, she said softly, her voice trembling. I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know if I can keep living like this. My heart dropped at her words. She was finally breaking. Finally admitting that everything had fallen apart. I don't know if I can forgive him, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. But I also don't know if I can live without him. The weight of her words crushed me. I didn't have the answers. I didn't know how to fix this. I didn't know what the right thing to do was. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't make this decision for her. She had to find her own way. I'm so sorry, Mom, I whispered, reaching out to her. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to make this better. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me, holding me tightly. I don't know either, sweetheart. But I'll figure it out. I just need time. We stood there together in silence, both of us broken in our own ways. Neither of us knew what the future held. But one thing was certain, our family was never going to be the same again. Weeks had passed since that night. The house had become a hollow shell of the home I once knew. My mother was still distant, still trapped in her grief. My father, though he made attempts to talk, to make amends, only seemed to dig the hole deeper. The facade of normalcy was long gone. The only thing left was the weight of choices we all had to make, whether we were ready to face them or not. I spent most of my days in a blur, trying to avoid confrontation, trying to avoid any moment of clarity. But I could feel it, the turning point coming. I had no more room for indecision. No more space to run from the truth that was hanging over me. It was time to make a choice. One morning, my mother came into my room unexpectedly. She looked better, more herself than she had in weeks. Her eyes weren't as hollow, though there was still a sadness there. She sat down on the edge of my bed, and for the first time in a long time, I could see the spark of strength in her again. "Izzy," she began, her voice soft but determined, "I've been thinking a lot. About everything. About him. About us. About what's next." I swallowed hard, unsure of where this was going. "What do you mean, Mom?" She looked at me, her gaze steady. "I don't know if I can forgive him. I don't know if I want to. But I'm tired of letting him control my life. I'm tired of letting this betrayal define who I am." I nodded, feeling a mix of emotions rush through me. My heart broke for her, but I was also proud of her. Proud that she was starting to take control of her own future. "I'm not asking you to make the decision for me, Izzy," she continued. "But I need you to understand that whatever happens next, it's my choice. Not his. Not yours." I reached out and squeezed her hand. "I understand, Mom. You don't have to explain." She smiled faintly, the first real smile I had seen from her in a long time. "Thank you. But there's something else I need to talk to you about." She took a deep breath before continuing, "I need you to know that no matter what happens, you're not in the middle of this anymore. This is my fight, and I'll figure it out. But you need to decide, too. You need to decide where you stand." Her words struck me like a punch to the gut. Where did I stand? I had been so caught up in trying to protect her, trying to make sense of it all, that I had forgotten that I, too, had a choice to make. My father had betrayed her, yes. But he was still my father. I still loved him, in some twisted way, even if I couldn't forgive him. And my mother who had given everything for this family, was standing at the crossroads, unsure of which path to take. But I knew deep down that the hardest decision was going to be mine. That afternoon, I went for a walk to clear my head. The cold wind whipped through my hair as I made my way through the quiet streets of our neighborhood. My thoughts were jumbled, swirling with everything I had been avoiding. I thought about my father, his remorse, his attempts to rebuild what had been broken. I thought about my mother, how strong she was, how brave she was in the face of her pain. But I also thought about myself. Where did I belong in all of this? As I walked, my mind wandered back to a conversation I had overheard between my parents a few days before. My father had pleaded with my mother, asking for a chance to make things right, to try to fix their marriage. I had heard the desperation in his voice. But I had also heard the uncertainty in hers. She didn't know if she could ever trust him again. I was torn. I was stuck between the man who had raised me, who had provided everything I could ever need, and the woman who had given me life, who had taught me everything about love, strength, and grace. The choice was no longer just about them. It was about me. What did I want for my future? Could I live with the idea of them together, broken and imperfect? Could I find peace in accepting my father's betrayal, or would I always feel the weight of it between them, between all of us? I didn't know the answer, but I knew one thing: I couldn't keep running from this decision. The time had come. By the time I made my way back home, I had resolved that I would finally speak to both of them. It was time to put an end to the silence, to the waiting. I was going to have to choose, not between my parents, but between the kind of life I wanted for myself. That evening, after dinner, I sat down with my father. He had been quieter than usual, his attempts at normalcy falling flat in the wake of everything. I could see the weariness in his eyes, the toll the past few weeks had taken on him. But I didn't feel sympathy. Not anymore. "Dad," I began, my voice steady but firm, "we need to talk." He looked at me, as if bracing himself for whatever I was going to say. "What is it, Izzy?" I swallowed before continuing, "I need to know where you stand. I need to know if this situation is something you want to fix, or if you're just going to keep pretending like everything's fine. I can't do this anymore." He looked down, running a hand through his hair, then looked back at me, his expression weary but sincere. I'm trying, Izzy. I really am. I want to fix this, I want to make things right. I shook my head. It's not enough. You've hurt Mom. You've hurt all of us. And I don't know if I can forgive you for that. He seemed to sink into his chair, his shoulders sagging as he accepted the reality. I understand. And I need you to know, I continued, my voice breaking, I don't know what's going to happen with Mom. But whatever she decides, I need to respect it. And I need you to respect it too. His eyes flickered with emotion, but he nodded, silent. I stood up, turning away from him. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I don't know what's next for any of us. But I do know that I can't keep being in the middle of all of this anymore. With that, I left him sitting there, alone with the consequences of his choices. Later that night, I spoke to my mother. She was sitting in her study, going through some designs, her face drawn and tired. But when she saw me, she gave me a small, weary smile. Izzy, she said quietly, her voice trembling. I've made my decision. My heart skipped a beat, but I remained silent, waiting for her to continue. I'm leaving him, she said, her voice firm and steady despite the pain in her eyes. I'm not going to let him keep destroying me. I deserve better than that. And so do you. A tear slipped down my cheek as I crossed the room and hugged her. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, and the hardest thing I had ever seen her do. But I knew, in that moment, that she was making the right choice, for herself, for me, and for us. I'm proud of you, Mom, I whispered, holding her close. I love you. I love you too, sweetheart, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. And we'll get through this. Together. The decision had been made. The path ahead was unclear, but I knew that it was mine to walk. And no matter where it took me, I was ready.